What if I told you that behind the dazzling lights of the stage, behind the moonwalk and the diamond glove, behind the legend of the King of Pop, there was a man trapped in a storm so powerful that it threatened to erase everything he built? Michael Jackson wasn't just the biggest entertainer on earth. He was also one of the most accused, investigated, and misunderstood figures in music history. And yet, even with the world watching, screaming his name and waiting for his every move, Michael lived with shadows that followed him everywhere. But what were those shadows really about? Were they a reflection of truth, or a mirror of society's obsession with destroying icons? To understand Michael Jackson's story, you can't just look at the glittering career that sold hundreds of millions of records and made him a household name across every continent. You have to dive into the darker chapters, the headlines that filled newspapers, the whispers that became shouts, and the accusations that nearly broke him. Because while his artistry seemed superhuman, his reality was brutally human. The first wave of accusations came in 1993, when a young boy and his family accused Michael of unspeakable acts. Overnight, the headlines exploded. This wasn't about music anymore. It was about morality, power, money, and the image of a man who had spent his entire life in front of cameras. For Michael, who had been famous since he was a child, the world had always seen him as a performer. But now they weren't watching his dance moves. They were dissecting his private life, his friendships, his home, his eccentricities. Suddenly, the Neverland Ranch, once seen as a magical playground, became the stage of suspicion. But here's the question nobody ever stopped to ask. How much of it was evidence and how much of it was perception? The media didn't care. Scandal sells, and Michael Jackson, the most famous man alive, was the biggest scandal imaginable. His face was on every magazine, his name on every news channel, his reputation on trial before he ever stepped into a courtroom. For the first time, fans around the globe wondered, who really was Michael Jackson when the lights went out? The case was settled outside of court. Millions of dollars exchanged hands. For some, that was proof of guilt. For others, it was proof that Michael wanted peace, that he was willing to pay any price to protect himself and his family from the relentless circus. He always insisted he was innocent, always, and yet the stain remained. No matter how many records he sold afterward, no matter how many times he stood on stage and heard the screams of thousands, those whispers never went away. Fast forward to 2003. A documentary called Living with Michael Jackson reignited the fire. In it, Michael spoke with the journalist Martin Bashir and admitted, with his childlike honesty, that he sometimes shared his bedroom with children, not in the way the world imagined, but in the way he saw as pure, innocent, almost spiritual. He spoke about it with sincerity, as if he didn't understand how the world could twist it. But the world did twist it. That footage was broadcast everywhere, edited for maximum shock value, and instantly became fuel for a new storm. Soon after, new allegations came. This time, the case went to trial. For Michael, it was the ultimate nightmare. The King of Pop, sitting in court, facing charges that could put him behind bars for decades. The cameras followed his every move, his every step to the courthouse, his frail frame in oversized suits, his face pale and exhausted. And the world divided. Some saw a predator finally cornered. Others saw a broken man being crucified by fame, by money-hungry opportunists, by a society that couldn't resist tearing down a giant. The 2005 trial became one of the most watched court cases in history. Witnesses testified, evidence was scrutinized, and Michael's private life was laid bare in ways that seemed almost unbearable. But after months of headlines, after months of humiliation, after months of being treated like a criminal, the jury delivered its verdict, not guilty, on all counts. Michael Jackson walked out of that courtroom an innocent man in the eyes of the law. But innocence in court doesn't erase suspicion in culture. The damage was done. The media didn't write headlines about his acquittal with the same passion they wrote headlines about his arrest. The public memory often freezes at the most dramatic image. The mugshot, the trial, the accusations. And for Michael, that meant his legacy would forever be tied not only to his music, but also to the storms that surrounded him. Now here's the truth we don't like to admit. Michael Jackson's story tells us more about us than it does about him. About how society builds icons only to tear them down. About how fame, money, and power attract not only admiration, but also enemies. About how the same media that crowned him king was the first to sharpen the guillotine. Was Michael eccentric? Absolutely. Was he naive in how he presented himself? Without a doubt. Did he surround himself with people who didn't always have his best interests at heart? Clearly. But does that make him guilty of the worst accusations? Or was he a man trapped between his childlike nature and a world obsessed with scandal? Think about this. Every friend who stood close to him, every celebrity who knew him from Elizabeth Taylor to Macaulay Culkin, testified about his kindness, his innocence, his generosity. They described him as someone who never grew up, someone who lived in a world of imagination, because the real world had been stolen from him since childhood. For his fans, this was Michael, not the monster painted by tabloids, but a wounded soul who turned pain into art. And yet for his critics, the accusations will always linger, because once an image is burned into the public mind, it's almost impossible to erase. Michael knew that. He once said, "The bigger the star, the bigger the target." And he was the biggest star of them all. So, where does that leave us? On one hand, we have the man who changed music forever, whose songs still play at weddings, at clubs, at stadiums, whose dance moves inspired generations. On the other hand, we have the endless debates, the documentaries, the arguments online about his guilt or innocence. Michael Jackson is both, the icon and the controversy, the dream and the nightmare. And maybe that's why he continues to fascinate us. Because he isn't simple. He's complicated, messy, larger than life, and yet fragile in ways that make us wonder how much of him was human and how much of him was myth. In the end, the accusations didn't silence him. They scarred him, yes, but they didn't erase the music, the performances, the magic. When you hear Billie Jean or Thriller or Man in the Mirror, you don't think of the courtroom. You think of the genius. You think of the man who made you feel something that no one else could. That's the paradox of Michael Jackson. He was both the accused and the adored, both the scandal and the spectacle, both the victim and the legend. And maybe that's why we still can't look away. Because the story of Michael Jackson is really the story of us. Our hunger for heroes, our obsession with flaws, our need to build and destroy. Michael once sang, "Leave me alone." But the truth is, the world never could. And perhaps in some haunting way, that's why he remains immortal.